start our recording and introduce Ashley Philippsen. So Ashley has a really interesting history in her employment, including having been involved with Teach for America, being a program director at Leadership Tulsa, who helped us launch our Thrive Tulsa program. She has gone to the MetCares Foundation, which is interested in educational and economic development in North Tulsa. And then she went to work for Mayor Bynum, looking at economic initiatives and particularly building equity around those. She's also taken on a new role, and I don't know if you'd be willing to give us a few words about what you'll be doing there, but the thread that fills out all of that work she has done has to do with equity. And I have learned so much from her over these last years about how you do human-centered design in a way that puts the people who are most close to the opportunities and challenges the most power and control over how those solutions are implemented. So hopefully I've done an okay job explaining the topic you and I discussed, Ashley, but I'm so glad to have you here. I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here this morning, and I'm about to try to share my screen without incident. I know Wendy's going to mind the chat box, which is great because on this computer, Wendy, I can't see it. And as I told Wendy, I would love a conversational experience. So I will not talk at the group as much. I'll try to get through some headlines and then would love just some discussion as much as possible. But as she said, my name is Ashley Philippsen. I saw some familiar faces on, and I'm excited to get started. So I'm joining Wendy in our virtual fireside chat with my coffee from Fulton Street to share anecdotes and approaches to community-centered design and processes. And success looks like us discussing a framework for public participation that we've used in the last couple of years. At the city, I was introduced to a framework from our Chief Resilience Officer, Crystal Reyes, that kind of put words and a tool to what we've done for a while in different work streams that I've had. And then let's take that and examine engagement in our respective work streams. So I hope that you're able to reflect on how you do this, whether it's at work, whether it's in an auxiliary organization, whether it's in your neighborhood, and walk away with some ideas to implement in your own lives. So journey with me, if you will. I want you to think about, Chip and Joanna Gaines have approached you and, they said, hey, we have this grant. We love what you do. We're going to build you a home. And you are thrilled because you've seen their show and all its shiplap glory, and you think you're about to get a modern home, right? So you kind of just trust them because they're Chip and Joanna Gaines. So you wanted something grand, and then you end up getting a lovely Victorian style home. And Wendy, if this were you, just tell me a little bit of the emotions you would feel. Gratitude, of course. Let's understand you're grateful for a free home, right? Or a free home. But what are your initial thoughts?
What are my initial thoughts on this beautiful Victorian home?
I shouldn't ask you like older homes, but
yeah. So I guess that would be the question, though. It's like, this is gorgeous on the outside. What kind of maintenance am I going to have to do? Do I have enough bathrooms? Is the shower going to be super, strong and cozy and all of that? And who's going to take care of the yard, I guess, would be another good
right.
question. Yeah.
Well, Wendy is so kind. I tried this on my husband to see how it was as a hook. And he was like, he loves modern homes. And he was like, man, I wish they would have asked me, for some insight so I could have had a little bit of a hand in the process. So Wendy, I also love your questions on, necessities. Are those things covered? And while this is a light example, it is kind of an anecdote for why it's critical to involve your end users or people most proximate to the problem, the issue, the project in the design of an experience or an intervention so that those questions are answered from the outset. So I hope that that kind of frames up what I'm going to share. So if you Google the spectrum of public participation, a framework similar to this will show up. And this is a helpful guide for setting out what you're going to do. And I'll get into how this fits into my work, but I just wanted to kind of ground us in common language. So whenever engaging the public, you can inform people all the way to, it says empower. I'm going to say equip because empower kind of insinuates that you have power to give someone, which means they didn't have power. Now we know people are excluded from processes, but people have power. So it's just a linguistic thing. You can embrace it or not. But anyway, there are some things that we do to inform people. If you go to, the City of Tulsa website and it says, hey, this street is going to be closed. That is information that people get versus placing the final decision-making in the hands of people, which takes a lot of courage. Wendy knows this, especially in a lot of our work that we've done together. Former Mayor Roger Randall has said, where there are people, there are problems because you have different perspectives, you have different opinions, and it often makes things messy because we don't all agree. And there's this healthy storming that happens before we norm together and then perform together. So it's not a light task, which is why a lot of people stick here on this bottom end of the spectrum. We're just going to inform people and then let the chips fall where they may. You can also consult with people, which still is, none of these are bad or inherently good. It's just a spectrum here where we see a lot of people get feedback on, design plans for an area of town when I'm thinking about the city perspective, or when we think about the district getting feedback from parents on virtual learning. And then you see the blurbs that come out on social media or in emails. Then to take it a further step, rigor is involving people, where you see steering committees formed, where you continually come together with parents, speaking from an education standpoint, and students, or coming from a city standpoint with residents. And we are continually working together, getting feedback from concerns and doing this iterative process until we come to an agreement on a step forward. And very closely related, going down the spectrum even more, is when we collaborate. And I'll tell an anecdote about that in just a second. But we're partnering in each step of the decision process. And it's not just feedback where we come back into our offices, do something, and then come back, but we're actually building something together, where we see, the diversity of perspectives often leads to innovation, and centering, like I said, your end user often leads to a product or an outcome that is more utilized by people, and people are more invested in. And then lastly, this equip or empower stage is, all right, we're going to actually say you make the decision here. And that is the ultimate step of public participation. And we're going to go forward with it. So I would love to, I can't see the chat box right now, but in your experience as a resident, or in your experience as an employee or entrepreneur in your respective lines of work, can you type in the chat box how you've been engaged or have engaged others in a public process, if at all? And I would love for Wendy to surface those out if she can, if anybody has anything to share.
Yeah,
but I would love
we'll give people a minute to type, because that's a complicated enough thing. It's more
Yeah.
than just a word. So it was so interesting as you were talking, because you can see how clearly this plays out in a public governmental setting. And I can totally see how the bigger comfort level is on the lighter side of individual engagement. But I was definitely thinking from a nonprofit perspective, how often we fall on that informing and consulting end, as opposed to really the collaborate and the empower end, although I guess our boards are one example of how we involve and collaborate with
Yes.
the idea of the board being representative of whatever constituency we are serving, that they then come in and are involved and collaborate. So that was
Yes.
a thought that I had as I was listening.
Thanks, Wendy. Has anybody else surfaced an example? And it's okay if they don't. But
Well, and
okay.
it might be easier to let people unmute, but Justin, thank
Okay.
you. He did put in, we often have conversations about culture with the entire team to problem solve together and build the environment we want to work in a collaborative fashion. And Miriam says the Tulsa Area United Way has a community investment process. I'm familiar with that, Miriam, where the volunteers are given oversight of the dollars raised in our annual process. That's a great example.
That's cool. Did not know that. Okay. Anything else before we move on from this slide, Wendy, or anyone else?
Justin, if you don't mind unmuting for a minute, tell us more about the effort that you were relating to there, and then Shelley's shared one that I'll share out.
Awesome.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we do like biannual surveys that just kind of assess where we are culturally at Reading Partners, and instead of kind of decisions being made, at a leadership team level or something like that to try to direct or adjust course, we bring those results and are very transparent about what we're seeing, and then try to problem solve specific gaps together and celebrate and acknowledge where things are going well. So it's not always that we, at the end of those meetings, we don't commit to doing everything that comes out as ideas, but we do commit to at least responding to every idea that's come out of those meetings, and then being really clear about what we are going to do in response and what might have to wait or what we can't afford, or some of the bigger ideas, being comfortable like saying no to some things too. But at least everybody feels a part of the process, and it's a very collaborative thing that we all kind of commit to solving together rather than counting on a couple people to do it.
Love that.
And Shelley shares an interesting example. She says when she worked at the Oklahoma Department of Commerce, she laughs, I'm sure, and said, we got a lot of input on where to put the water fountain, but very little input from communities as to what economic development they were interested in. And she says, for the record, this isn't a good example of how to collect input, but it actually reminded me that people probably feel pretty confident in their opinion on where the water fountain should go. They may not feel as confident in their opinion about economic development. And it strikes me that there's also a process whereby there's a facilitation and information sharing so people feel like they have enough data in which to be authentically involved. Because if you ask me right now what kind of economic development I'd like to see for Tulsa, well, and because I have so many of these conversations, I might have opinions, but I might be shy about sharing them, not knowing that I really have the expertise or the depth of involvement. So setting up a place where I feel empowered, of course you were, or equipped, better word, equipped, to to give feedback in a way that's both useful and I feel confident around.
Yeah. You bring up an excellent point, Wendy, which is why for people who do this often, there's a lot of value and need for intentional planning with the questions that you ask. And I will get to that point, I guess, in the next slide, if you're ready to move on.
Go for it.
So yeah, just we'll put a pin in questioning when we involve, collaborate, or consult people. So just a quick overview of where I have been able to apply this spectrum from the International Association for Public Participation. If you want to check them out, they have a lot of resources on their site. I'm going to just kind of do an overview of the last couple of years for relevance. So Wendy mentioned I just left the city in December as the Deputy Chief of Community Development and Policy. Was briefly the Deputy Chief for Inclusive Economic Growth. And while there, was charged with designing a community involvement process with some land that we are going to develop. I'm currently and still a commissioner on Tulsa Development Authority, so gratefully still involved with that project and get to see that vision come to life. And I'm going to share that. And then I'm also going to share, I'm on the commission, the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. And I share our commemorative experiences, and we'll share how some feedback, and I'll actually lead with that. When I joined the mayor's staff, I was able to be his proxy on the commission. And that was probably the most, I had the most trepidation about joining the commission when I took the role, because of public sentiment about the commission. There's a lot of distrust in early 2019, late 2018 about the commission, and, who gets to tell the story of Greenwood and the massacre. And I was like, oh gosh, I don't want to be affiliated with any controversy. So when I sat down with our fellow commissioners, and I was like, hey, there's a lot of concern about public participation and input in this platform that the commission has. So we then had we had a series of community meetings where we asked, like, what does it mean to commemorate the massacre? Public meetings and some closed door, or not closed door, but smaller meetings with especially North Tulsa leaders. And what came from that is, how are we sharing that stage and that platform? So from there, I designed a commemorative grants process. WPX generously gave about $150,000. And instead of just these, larger organizations, the commemoration saying, this is how we're going to commemorate the massacre, residents and just just people could apply for up to $10,000 to commemorate Greenwood, to revere the victims of the massacre in ways that they deemed essential. And when we go here, that's that's just equipping people within the boundaries, of course, of how are you commemorating the massacre, to do what they want to do, and ensure that the story is shared in multiple ways. So that's one way of just saying, here's resources that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Go ahead and commemorate the massacre. And that information is on our Tulsa 2021 website. And people have done a variety of things that we will see come to pass this year. The other larger initiative that I've been able to take on, like I mentioned, this Kirkpatrick Heights, I don't know why it's super small. Let me go to Google right quick. For those of you familiar with the downtown area, I still don't know why it's super small. I'll just go to maps right quick. If you all will humor me for 1 second. So as you may or may not know, when the highway was built in Tulsa, near downtown, we had to, of course, clear land to do that. So if you look right here, there's Kane's Ballroom is right here. This is the historic Greenwood area. OSU had about 55 acres of this land in this area for the last 40 years. In 2018, Tulsa Development Authority actually turned that land back over to the city to be developed. Knowing that this land is so close to downtown, and of course, downtown is rapidly developing, but this land is also, land that residents were moved from to make way for the highway. It is a particularly delicate opportunity where we don't want to displace residents. And we also want to make sure that it is a responsive development. So as a Tulsa Development Authority commissioner, still working with the city here, there will be a community coalition working hand in hand with the firm that will eventually help master plan this area. And instead of one developer coming and getting to develop the entire swath of the 55 acres, it's going to be incrementally developed. So smaller developers have an opportunity to contribute to the design of this space, and community members really feel part of what will eventually be, a restoration of land that was historically occupied by North Tulsa residents. So it's this blue area, which I'm sorry, it's super small. And then this area on Greenwood all the way up to just south of Carver Middle School. So that process has not started. I anticipate it starting sometime in February. But those are like the two, I would say, like largest participatory processes I've been part of. And then the last one, I don't know, Bruce, you probably remember this as a resident of the Heights area, but in 2019, there was like this scare of eminent domain in the same area all the way to like Pine between 75, the Tisdale and Peoria with Tulsa Development Authority because it was, people were informed, but people were not consulted before this amendment to use eminent domain was published. So it resulted in, understandable fear and anger. So Tulsa Development, the mayor said, we're going to stop. We're not going to entertain eminent domain. We're going to step back and work with community members. So Vanessa Hall Harper, she's the District 1 counselor, identified about 30 residents from different neighborhoods in this parcel of land. And we have spent the last 12 months learning about urban renewal, learning about eminent domain, learning about alternatives to eminent domain. And because of this collaborative process, I will not say it's not an equip or empower situation, but the group, which is called the Greenwood Unity Heritage Citizens Advisory Team, made the recommendation, hey, how can we develop this area, this sector, without using eminent domain? So Tulsa Development Authority said, all right, we're going to do a 2-year moratorium, and we will revisit this, where we won't use eminent domain at all, and we're going to explore the recommendations this group has suggested. They suggested these community benefits agreements. So I say all of that to say, while it takes time, it takes intentionality, it is much more beneficial to do things with people instead of to them or for them. And I found it has immense benefits when done well and when done authentically. And you see more investment, which is the whole point of any type of process where multiple people are involved. So Wendy, I will stop there and just explain. So I left my job at the city late December and took a role at Impact Tulsa, much for the same reasons that you've seen me take different roles. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation granted Impact Tulsa a grant for policy, advocacy, and mobilization efforts for families and students, especially post-COVID, when we're seeing so many students not in school or not completing school. And it's, I would say, not to be dramatic, but it's a state of emergency, especially here when we have such a post-secondary gap in terms of students being college ready. My first roles have always been rooted in education and just applying what I have learned and done. Saw this as an excellent opportunity to impact systems change, since Impact Tulsa, of course, works across 22 school districts. So that is what I currently do, and I will stop for questions and discussion.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm still here. I was unmuting myself. Oh, good. So it's really great to have this opportunity to dive into thinking about this. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were wrapping that up is, and maybe you can think of a situation, but I can think of a situation where I was brought in to facilitate a meeting for a sort of governmental group that was doing some feedback sessions. And I do a lot of facilitation, so I helped. And it was really interesting because I think that the individuals in that meeting were under the impression they were collaborating, whereas it was pretty clear to me that it was more of a consulting situation. So it seems like I love the rubric and to be very clear about what you're doing, but what is the danger of miscommunicating? Like, we're all into collaboration, we love that word, but yes, when it's not authentically happening, what's the danger there?
Yeah. I would say the danger is at a minimum ire and anger and distrust. So when it comes to the development that I mentioned, there's also next to BMX, there's called this Evans Fin Tube area that we just completed a feasibility study for. And made a point to pull in folks who historically have been a part of those conversations. And because we have a lot of plans without implementation, they're like, I don't want to be a part of this, or, I don't trust that anything's going to happen from this process. So distrust, which is really hard to build back, which is why I said the planning is so important. I'm very clear with people when I say, that's why I pop everything. This is the purpose of this conversation. This is how we're going to engage. Here's what it is, and here's what it's not. And do continual checks for understanding and continual reminders so people understand this is not this, because it's really hard to come back from that. And you're using people's time. So.
Yeah, and if we've been brought to the same convening time after time after time, and there's no impact or effort of that, we're not going to be as willing to give our time. So how can this be? So I can see how it can be used in governmental work. I can see how it can be used in nonprofit work. How can it be used in for-profit work? Do you have any thoughts on that, or anyone else on
Yes.
the call?
Oh, okay. I have thoughts, and then I would love to hear from other people.
Yeah. Why don't we start with your thoughts, and then others can kind of think.
So I'm a huge fan of the Gallup Q12 survey for those who do some type of engagement survey. And I love seeing a thriving staff where people feel engaged at all levels. So the participatory process is critical, whether it is bringing your staff together quarterly on goals, whether it's bringing your staff together on their experience. Working in different contexts, especially a corporate setting, you have your annual review. But outside of that formal process, are there feedback loops embedded in conversations? Wendy, you know this. I asked you for feedback all the time. How are people across levels of the corporate structure shaping their experience? So whenever decisions are made, what is the forethought of the leaders in bringing people in? I would say that's how I see it done in corporate structures. Or now that people are feeling safer to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that framework of how we address that in our organization should not reside at the top. What are the focus groups, and how are you understanding the experience of people along lines of difference? So that how are you consulting those folks and maybe helping shape it? For example, if we say, we're going to do business resource groups, let's go ahead and do them. And then you don't have people sign up to show them. Fielding questions from folks on, well, how does this work with my hours? How does this work with coming together? What is our purpose? Are we coming together for an affinity space? So I would say any type of planning or initiative where more than two people have to engage is an opportunity to leverage that framework.
And it also gets back to the point that I was thinking about earlier, which is if something's already been decided, don't pretend to consult or collaborate, that there really does have to be some authentic two-way communication there. Are you still with me, Ashley? Oh yeah, there you are. I thought maybe you'd frozen for a second. So anyone else have thoughts about how this could be used in more of a corporate structure? And you can unmute yourself if you have an idea you'd like to share. Great. Well, LaDonna has a question about Impact Tulsa and asks if you have any data on the internet connection or access for our TPS students for remote learning. So that's kind of a technical question, but do you have any instance of that?
Yeah, so at the start of the pandemic, I don't have the specific data, but at the start of the pandemic, the City of Tulsa, Impact Tulsa, and about 40 community partners, some on this call, joined to talk about internet access. And when we started out, I do recall 10% of households across the county, according to data, didn't have internet access. So that's where the hotspots came in. So Union, Jenks, TPS, and other districts partnered with AT&T and Cox to ensure, and Verizon, to ensure that parents could either get affordable Wi-Fi in their home or hotspots. So I don't know where that usage is now, but I know the efforts of the city and Impact Tulsa resulted in kids being able to log on for those that were at home.
Yeah, extraordinary times. Justin says that leading teams is very similar, whether nonprofit or corporate. So true. And good leadership practices like this apply in both settings.
Yep.
I actually think it's an interesting idea too of like engaging customers in the design of products. There's actually a long history of that in focus groups and beta testing and some of that. So
one of the biggest questions that's actually like on my plate for the next couple of weeks is this challenge of, lots of students have been at home and doing virtual learning. So to say, hey, sophomore, going into your junior year, come back and sit in this classroom. What does that look like? How are people re-onboarding students who have had a lot of autonomy? Does school have to look totally different? So that is part of my charge in hearing from young people on how we're going to reintegrate a lot of folks who have been virtual, knowing that our virtual numbers are really high in the county. So
I think that's an interesting point about HR and work from home too, right? They say that the work from home is going to stay in part because so many people have discovered that they can be super productive with fewer of those 9 to 5 butt in seats restrictions. And those of us who lead teams are really going to have to be thoughtful about that and engaging people like, okay, what are the values of coming together in person, and how do we balance that with the freedoms we've come to know and enjoy?
Yes, and from an economic development standpoint, when I think about all the subways that are closing across the city, what is the economic impact of people not going into these office buildings in our work building districts where lots of employees go? So there's a lot of
there's ripple effects is what you're really referring to. And then that got me thinking about, leaving the decisions in the hands of the end user. How do you navigate that if the people in power see ripple effects of the decisions the end user makes that they think, how do you balance, okay, this group of end users made this decision for their community, but it's got ripple effects on other communities. Have you all dealt with any of that at the city or?
I have not. I'm glad I have not dealt with that. I always tell Mayor Bynum, I would never want your job, because that's where you have, you're going to always have varying opinions about things. But I would say what's going to have the greatest, I've seen, like when I think about the flood situation and different decisions he had to make there, or with the mask mandate or the lockdown. I've just seen a rationale over like what's going to have the greatest good for people. But I have fortunately not had to do that. Most of my participatory processes have been able to be led by people who can own the decision.
Well, and there's a whole list of jobs that I now have through all of this that I'm really glad that I don't have. So, so kind of as a final thought or a final word, as we are designing processes, what is the piece of advice that you would give us as far as being really thoughtful in how we design the processes to maximize that grid that you showed us?
Say that one more time.
Yeah. Sorry. So what advice do you have for us as we're designing processes with whatever constituents we're dealing with, whether they're an employee base, a end user group, customer base? If we're thinking about that grid, how would you want us to incorporate that into our work?
Yeah. I would say, and this sounds super hokey, but I swear by it, do your own strategic thought process. So Wendy knows, everybody at Leadership Tulsa knows, we go by the purpose, the outcomes, and the process, right? So whenever you are sitting down to do something, what is the intended outcome, right? If this is the intended outcome, what is required to get there? So if I want to launch 100 books will be read by, our neighborhood in 2020, 2021, 2022, or whatever. to #literacy, #reading partners. If I'm going to do that, I want to I'm going to need to sit with people to figure out, how do you get access to books? What's going to incentivize it? I'm not going to think of those myself. Like, there's beauty in collaboration. So I think sitting with your intent, sitting with your desired outcomes will allow you to think through, well, who are the people that need to be involved? What questions do I have? And that way you can, to me, with any initiative, design a people-centered process. Urgency is the enemy of equity. I heard that 2 weeks ago. Our tendency to want to do things in a microwave popcorn fashion is what often makes us skip anything of meaningful engagement. So being intentional, being organized, I think is critical there.
Urgency is the enemy of equity. I think that is a great takeaway. The other thing you taught me, and I don't know if it's something that you came up with, but that whole thing about that you can't do something for people without them, because if you do something for someone without them, it's doing it to them. And that phrase is one that I first heard when you were running programs for Leadership Tulsa, and I think it's one that we all could keep deep in our psyche as we're planning things. Excellent. I hope everyone feels that they have learned something today, as I have. I have recorded this session, and periodically I'll be sending out the recordings. If you would like a copy of Ashley's slides, I did take a photograph of the grid that she laid out, which I will be posting to our Facebook today. But if you'd like anything, Ashley, I don't know if you shared your contact information or if people should just contact me. Either one is fine.
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to respond to LaDonna. My email is ashley@impacttulsa.com. And I welcome any emails, follow-up, etc.
Good. Well, I, for one, am so grateful for your work in Tulsa, that you can continue to be committed to our work at Leadership Tulsa, and congratulations on being a new board member at Leadership Tulsa as well. Thank you, everyone. Next week, we have Tulsa Speech and Hearing Association, talk about equity. How do we include our deaf community in the work we do?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Can't wait to tune in.